The horror genre is filled with all different types of subgenres. You have your slashers, your psychological thrillers, antichrist stories, and many more, and they all offer different types of frightening thrills to us viewers. Some make you afraid of the monster living under your bed, others fill your mind with existential dread. But then there are those that show you something much closer to home, the unlimited potential mankind has for depravity, something that's far more impactful than any fantastical boogeyman could ever hope to be. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 235th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the Firefly family from the Firefly trilogy. Since their debut in the year 2003, the Firefly family have become icons of the horror genre, specifically the three most prominent members of it: Baby Firefly, Otis Driftwood, and of course, the legendary Captain Spalding. But why are characters that are so utterly vile so utterly beloved? Well, in this video we're going to talk about why that is, and so much more. For even though these films aren't exactly filled with nuance, there's more than meets the eye when it comes to examining the intricacies of this ferocious family. Now, I don't like it as much as any of you do, but when dealing with sensitive subject matter here on YouTube, one has to be pretty careful to avoid the ire of Google. And well, the Firefly trilogy is all about dealing in sensitive subject matter. So when appropriate, I'll be using different terms to denote specific crimes, just so you're aware. An example being my switching of the R word with the word assault, but you should hopefully be able to spot the others when I mention them. Now, there's plenty of things that made the Devil's Rejects into the horror shows that they were, but for Captain Spalding, there's something much more sinister that went into making him into who he was: cheaply made mattresses. And you know what? Perhaps such vile pieces of furniture deserve their own episode in this series, so why don't we cover them now? And as it turns out, I know the perfect hero we can call on to defeat these insidious fiends. Our sponsor for this video, Titan Mattress. Captain Spalding was one behemoth of a clown, and a man like that couldn't possibly have been comfortable on the flea-bitten, non-supportive mattress that this cruel world forced upon him. Well, to find a cure, Titan Mattress was kind enough to send me one of their full-size Titan Plus Elite mattresses to see if this might have been the solution to Spalding's woes, and I'm here to tell you, it definitely would have been. With only a few days rest on this mattress, I could already feel a massive difference in my sleep hygiene. I'd always wanted an affordable, high-quality mattress that was breathable and supportive, and with their mix of heavy-duty coils and high-quality foam, I found that in Titan. And while this mattress is a great fit for any body type, for anyone out there who has a bigger frame that requires a little something extra, this mattress is a must-have. So what's the verdict? A mattress from Titan is one of the best that you can find, and I have no doubt that it would have been able to provide that little extra rest to Spalding that would have kept him away from murder and mayhem. So if you'd also like help defeating the evil that is your cheap and back-breaking mattress today, head over to titanmattress.com/THEVILEEYE and use the code VILEEYE at checkout to get 30% off your order of a Titan mattress. And as an added benefit, Titan offers a limited lifetime warranty as well as a 120-night sleep trial, so you can have plenty of time to figure out if this mattress is right for you. So don't delay, head over to titanmattress.com/VILEEYE and use the code VILEEYE to enhance your waking and sleeping worlds today. Thank you, Titan Mattress, for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Though the three most infamous members of the Firefly family are exactly that, there are 10 members of the family in total. Well, 11 if you count Dr. Satan. And those 10 include Mother Firefly, Grandpa Hugo, Earl, Tiny, Rufus, Foxy, Charlie, and of course, Cutter, Otis, and Baby. And most of these characters have had a hand in committing their fair share of atrocities. The thing is though, we aren't really given any information about these people aside from a few gritty details about some of their pasts, leaving our knowledge of who they are and why they came to be a group of such wicked individuals largely unknown. That being said, one doesn't necessarily need any backstory on this family of monstrosities to appreciate their characters and the stories they're in, for it's plain to see that each and every one of them commits horrendous acts of evil simply because they enjoy doing so. However, when looking at characters like the members of the Firefly family, it's natural for us to ask a very important question. Why are these people like this, and how did they come to be such hideous creatures? As I mentioned a moment ago, in the films themselves, we're never given an answer, but a website was created to promote the Devil's Rejects film in 2005, and on that website, there were biographies written by Rob Zombie for the three main characters that offer us a lot of useful information that helps us understand their characters more. Sadly, the entry on Baby Firefly has seemingly been lost to time, as I couldn't find it anywhere, even on the Wayback Machine, for the website for the film doesn't even work there anymore. But fortunately, a few people managed to save the entries on Spalding and Otis, so let's take a look at those now and see what we can find out. Captain Spalding. All the world loves a clown. That may be true, but in this case, I beg to differ. Meet Captain Spalding, the world's most notorious grease paint monster. This demented character began life on April 13, 1918, as Johnny Lee Johns. Johnny Lee was born into the small farming community of Rugsville County, although other reports state El Paso, Texas, as his actual place of birth. Either way, Johnny Lee ended up in Rugsville by the age of 5 and spent his early years in the Rugsville Home for Orphan Boys, where he was already considered a disposable youth. Sometime around 1928, the young troublemaker Johnny Lee was taken in by an extreme fundamentalist and local pastor named Theodore Jensen Rhodes, his wife Alice, and Charlie, their son. Charlie was the same age as Johnny, and the two were soon as close as real brothers. Johnny lived a repressive and solitary life of God on his new family's homestead and was ostracized by the community because the Rhodes were black. Young Johnny and brother Charlie dreamed of a more exciting life while helping run the family's 160-acre farm on the segregated outskirts of Rugsville. Both boys toiled under the increasingly harsh rules of the Pastor Rhodes until 1935, when a mysterious fire erupted in the family's house, killing both the pastor and his wife. Arson was suspected, but never proved. Johnny and Charlie, unfazed by the destruction of their house, continued to live on in the family's barn. Thanks to federal subsidiaries, Johnny and Charlie no longer needed to farm the land, and the boys soon abandoned it. So already we've gathered some rather interesting information. In The Devil's Rejects, we frequently hear Cutter refer to Charlie as his brother, and while I assumed he was either a good friend of his, or they were adopted siblings like I'm sure most of you did, it's nice to get some confirmation that Charlie is in fact Cutter's adopted brother. But more than that, what this info establishes for us is that Cutter and Charlie are in fact the two men who essentially created the Firefly family. In this excerpt, it's quite clearly implied that the fire that killed their adopted parents was started by Cutter and Charlie, two boys who wished for something more in their lives, who were suffering under the regime of two abusive individuals who dealt with their parents in brutal fashion. But there's much more still to cover, so let's continue. Eventually, 18-year-old Johnny stumbled upon the idea to create a clown character called Mr. Dong Dong Abobo. Johnny covered his face in grease paint and dressed in silk polka dot pajamas, working local parties and town functions. His outrageously vulgar humor and quick wit soon turned him into something of a local celebrity. Charlie, not to be outdone, began producing low-grade moonshine called Hoochie Coochie Hooch and began peddling it to local farmers and merchants. Meanwhile, Johnny Lee had begun to develop a deeply unhealthy interest in sideshow deformities and violent crime photography. Soon Johnny changed his clown character's name to Pigfucker Jones and adopted a far more sinister look. Pigfucker Jones soon became a rather morbid attraction and was no longer able to find work. By 1942, 26-year-old Johnny, now known solely as Pigfucker Jones, had given up the clowning business and joined forces with brother Charlie in his booming moonshine business, now expanded to include gambling and prostitution. Charlie, a silver-tongued devil if ever there was one, had been able to convince several local girls to turn tricks out of a local motel called the Dewdrop Inn. All was going perfectly for the two businessmen until the summer of 1945, when an irate customer began beating on one of the working girls. Pigfucker stepped in and stabbed the man. In fact, he stabbed the man 47 times and cut out both his eyes and sexual organs. Charlie and Pigfucker dumped the man's body in the Longwood Creek and never spoke of it again, although from that day forth, Charlie would always refer to his brother as Cutter. Around this same time, a bizarre series of murders known as the candy cane killings took place, so named for the fact that a candy cane was always left behind in the female victim's orifices. The first victim to be found was 18-year-old Jamie Phillips. Jamie shared a large house in Rugsville with several roommates and was found in her bed lying in a pool of blood and urine. The situation turned even darker when it was discovered that a broomstick had been rammed deep inside her. As unbelievable as it may seem, Jamie was still alive. Her roommates quickly called the local police. Jamie died before the police arrived. A candy cane was later found deep in her rectal cavity. Candy cane's next known victim was Linda Henry, a 21-year-old waitress. On January 31st, 1946, one of Linda's roommates received a call from Linda's boss. He said Linda had not shown up for work. A co-worker went into Linda's apartment and saw that her bedroom was covered in blood, and there had been signs of a struggle. Over the course of the next few months, 7 more women mysteriously vanished. Each case was remarkably similar in character and appearance. Each of the victims were Caucasian females and had disappeared in the evening hours. The mystery continued to haunt local residents until finally 2 of the missing girls' bodies were found in the summer of 1946. It was obvious to police that the girls, Carrie Carey and Janice Gallo, had been brutally murdered and savagely violated. There was no real evidence at the scene except the candy cane placed inside each girl. Another series of killings occurred in Bain County, where at least 3 women suddenly vanished. Several months later, one of those missing women's bodies were discovered in a dumpster behind a lumberyard. An autopsy revealed that she had been beaten and assaulted, much like the other victims. Once again, a candy cane was discovered inside of her. Meanwhile, back in Rugsville, Longwood Creek was the site for finding the killer's next victim. The muddy creek bed revealed the remains of 21-year-old Linda Henry. Meanwhile, during this period, Cutter and Charlie's ever-growing pimp business, which now included drugs and stolen cars, was on the rise. Then suddenly it all came crashing down as Charlie got busted. In 1945, during a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight, Charlie was caught with 20 pounds of marijuana. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison. How is the candy cane killer related to our man Cutter? Well, while in prison, Charlie bragged to other inmates that his brother was actually the candy cane killer. No one took him seriously, and nothing was ever done. Many years later, it would be revealed that Cutter truly was the killer. Lost and lonely with his partner in crime locked away, Cutter returned to his clowning ways. Cutter's unyielding fascination with the female body eventually led him to return to seeking out fresher samples. His next victims were 24-year-old Stacy Dayton, who disappeared from a local bar called The Dive in December 1946, and a 19-year-old Jeannie Drummer, who disappeared on the 16th of January 1946. Miss Drummer's brother, Frank, was a sheriff's deputy. Learning that Cutter had been spotted in town on the day of his sister's disappearance, Frank and the sheriff went to check out old Cutter's place. Cutter's house was already infamous amongst the local children as a haunted house. Cutter was clever, and police could find no evidence to connect him to the disappearances. Well, with all of that information in hand, I think we can safely assume that, while Charlie had a hand in committing the catalyst crime for the eventual birth of the Firefly family, that it was in fact Cutter who was the one who pushed his adopted brother into killing their parents, as there is no mention of Charlie committing or participating in these candy cane murders, or any other murders for that matter. So while Charlie would go on to become the criminal pimp we knew him as in The Devil's Rejects, he would evidently be spared from being influenced by Cutter's penchant for murder and kept himself clean in that regard. As for Cutter though, this is quite the damning start to his career as an arch-murderer, with the sick and depraved acts of his eventual family already echoed in his own actions prior to its formation. But as terrible as his crimes in these initial stages were, they're nothing compared to what he would soon birth alongside his new wife, Eve Wilson, better known today as Mother Firefly. Around the fall of 1947, while attending the state fair, Cutter met a young woman by the name of Eve Wilson. They soon began a whirlwind romance. 22-year-old Miss Wilson was a striking blonde beauty and also a first-class whore. Miss Eve came in with some heavy baggage, namely her bastard sons Rufus, who was only 6 years old but stood 5'6", and Tiny, a deformed 4-year-old, standing a shocking 5'8". Tiny was horribly disfigured in a fire caused by one of Eve's ex-lovers. Although over the years, Eve would constantly change her story on Tiny's bizarre appearance to suit her own purposes. Cutter loved the boys as his own. Soon he and Eve were married. On September 12, 1948, Eve gave birth to their only true love child, a healthy normal-sized girl named Vera Ellen. Not much is known about the family's activities over the next 10 years. The family made ends meet through Cutter's petty crimes and Eve's turning tricks for the local farmers. In the summer of 1958, Brother Charlie was released from prison and spent a year or so hanging around Cutter's house, helping Eve run her whore business. Everything was fine until one day Cutter caught Charlie taking nude and lewd snapshots of 12-year-old Vera Ellen. Cutter was furious, stabbing Charlie in the ass and sending him packing. Enter the devil. Around the summer of 1965, a stranger came calling, a person by the name of Otis Driftwood. Otis was a despicable character, but he and Cutter soon hit it off, and Otis was soon living with Cutter and his family, whom he called the Fireflys. In fact, Otis loved nicknames. Cutter was dubbed Captain Spalding after the lead character in a movie called Animal Crackers. Vera Ellen was soon known simply as Baby. Eve was Big Mama, and Tiny was often called Stumpfucker, a name of which he was not very fond. Rufus simply became Rufus Firefly. Spalding and Driftwood went on many a violent crime spree together, stealing anything and everything, even occasionally attempting a bank robbery. Spalding and Driftwood bragged about committing numerous crimes during this dark period. Starting in 1971 while Otis and Baby were off on their infamous satanic run, Captain Spalding remained behind to work on his most ambitious project yet, the construction of a museum dedicated to all things evil. He called this roadside atrocity Captain Spalding's Museum of Monsters and Madmen. Spalding's dream project opened its doors on October 31, 1972, and was soon picketed and protested by local religious groups led by Pastor Matthew Duke. The outcry was mainly over its featured attraction, it was the murder ride, and Spalding's children got in on half-price promotions. Pastor Duke soon mysteriously disappeared, and the controversy subsided. Years later, the Pastor Duke's decapitated corpse would be found in the Firefly's basement, serving as a doorstop. Spalding's museum business thrived over the next couple years due to the interest in a local legend known as Dr. Satan. No evidence of anyone going by the name of Dr. Satan has ever been discovered. In fact, it is now thought to be a complete creation of none other than Captain Spalding himself. Sometime during 1974, Spalding and Mama called it quits, and the captain moved out on his own, although his influence on the family was never far away. In fact, it's during this depressed loner period that Spalding did his worst, beginning when he attempted to sodomize a young girl named Lori Bird. Spalding lured her into the back of the museum, attacking the girl after she refused to perform oral sex. The girl went to the police, and Spalding was convicted of abuse. He was given a sentence of 7 years in prison. He served only 8 months, but it was long enough to send his life in mental facilities into a tailspin. Upon his release, Spalding found he couldn't keep a rein on his increasingly violent temper. On his own again, Spalding turned his attention on acquiring the company of young girls and killing them. In the summer of 1975, Spalding's warped fantasies of abuse and murder had taken over, and he began constantly cruising for young girls, luring them in with the pretext of employment at his fictitious modeling company. One he managed to convince was 18-year-old Susan Miller. He picked her up in an area known to be frequented by runaways. Taking the girl home, he tortured Miller, repeatedly knocking her unconscious with chloroform. It is thought that Miller was kept in Spalding's garage for over 6 months as his personal sex slave. Miller was forced to perform all manner of sick and twisted sexual acts for the demented clown. By 1976, Spalding's constant selling of the Dr. Satan myth had reached epic proportions, and he was now attracting out-of-state tourists to his museum to view his newly installed Dr. Satan attraction. This would provide a new steady stream of victims. But the worst was yet to come. Once again, we receive information that confirms one very crucial fact, that the man who enabled and facilitated all the Firefly depravity was Captain Spalding, the man who likely convinced his adopted brother to kill their parents in a house fire, and the man who would continue to kill as he aged, with a particular fixation on women. While Mother Firefly was a prostitute, prior to her entanglement with Cutter, there's no mention of her committing or enabling any sort of crimes. And owing to the fact that Tiny and Rufus were only children when Cutter got together with their mom, and essentially adopted them as his own children, we can safely say that Cutter is responsible for turning the two of them into willful participants in his murderous antics, and the same thing could be said for Baby. However, there seems to be some retroactive continuity errors here. For in House of 1,000 Corpses, Mother Firefly says much the same thing that's stated here, that Tiny was burned by one of her exes, and in the film, she specifies that it was her former husband Earl who did so, a man who we later learn lives in the catacombs beneath the field near the Firefly farm as a monstrosity known as the Professor, a status and station we can only assume he received via his contact with the dreaded Dr. Satan. Earl's presence near the home could be explained in a couple ways though. One is that he was one of the first people that Spalding and Eve took down together, luring him back to Dr. Satan's home so he might torture and transform him as revenge for what he did to Tiny. The other is that after Cutter left the home, perhaps Eve decided to call Earl back to her with an offer of rekindling their love or repairing their relationship for the sake of their children. But once he arrived, he was then given to Dr. Satan and made into the monster we see him as in the first film. I'm not sure what's true here, and if you have a better idea, let us know down below, but either of these options seem plausible enough. All that being said, there's still a tad more information we need to go through, that being Otis's biography, so let's take a look at that now. Otis Driftwood. It's a hard statement to make that one murderer is worse than the other. There is very little to differentiate a killing from another in terms of the actual act. However, some stand out nevertheless. These sick individuals take murder to a whole new level, an art form even. One may be persuaded to think of Albert Fish or England's famous Jack the Ripper when such a thought is entertained. Preposterous and vile, these are the mutilators and dismemberers of our world. The man I am about to speak of ranks among them. He is a devil in its true form, and his name is Otis B. Driftwood. Yes, some killers are true monstrosities, creatures who more resemble vicious animals than humans. In terms of evil, they broke the mold with Otis. Otis B. Driftwood was born into this world December 23, 1929, as Baby No Name. Unwanted by his psychotic father and mother, Baby No Name was brutally abused as a young child and horribly mistreated throughout his early years. Young No Name developed a love of bestiality and the torture of animals during his early years. It is hard to comprehend such horrors as a child and adolescent, but No Name dealt with them, and much more. Little did anyone know that a sinister creature had manifested in this frail, sickly child. A year later, all was found out. No Name wrote that his first murder came at the tender age of 13. This was supposedly a 17-year-old local girl he kidnapped from a roller skating rink parking lot. He claimed to have beaten her severely in the head, hauled her to an isolated area, and proceeded to attempt an assault. The girl came to and began to flail and scream. No Name simply strangled her to death at that point and assaulted her corpse. However, no incident of the sort has ever been reported. No Name tended to lie quite often, so whether or not this story is truth is anyone's guess. No Name was arrested soon after this for breaking and entering. He spent a short time in a Bain County detention school for boys. He was considered highly intelligent, yet severely disruptive during his incarceration. No Name claimed to have murdered a 15-year-old girl the day after his release. He was arrested again for breaking and entering and was in and out of jail until his release in 1959. At the age of 30, No Name had a criminal record a mile long. Around this time, No Name took to obsessively writing in diaries and keeping detailed scrapbooks of his life. The first important entry centered around the fact that No Name killed for a second time that year, stabbing his abusive father in a blind rage following a family dispute. His father died some 50 hours later of the wounds. No Name fled and was tracked down and arrested 14 days later in El Paso, Texas. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in a Texas state prison for second-degree murder. Sadly, overcrowding forced his release from prison in 1960. Upon exiting prison, No Name adopted the new name of Otis B. Driftwood, taken from the Marx Brothers film A Night at the Opera. Otis claims to have murdered 2 women soon after he was let loose, leaving one body close enough to the prison for the warden to see. As with his alleged first murder, no evidence was ever unearthed to support his claim. He was arrested again soon after for attempted kidnapping of a young girl and served 4 years before his release in 1965. This is where Otis Driftwood solidified himself as one of the worst of all time. Otis began a period of roaming, traveling everywhere from Wilmington, Delaware to Hurst, Texas. It was here that Driftwood met a petty thief named Cutter. Otis was soon living with Cutter and his family. In this deranged family, Otis Driftwood finally found a place to call home. Cutter's family consisted of his wife, who Otis called Mother, 2 sons named Tiny and Rufus, and his beautiful blonde daughter Vera Ellen, who Otis immediately bonded with and nicknamed Angel Baby. Driftwood and Cutter went on a reckless and violent tandem, stealing anything and everything. Driftwood later bragged about numerous crimes during this period. One involved shooting a convenience store clerk and watching Tiny desecrate the corpse. 1970 is where repetitive murdering for Otis Driftwood began. Another story shared by Otis in his infamous scrapbooks is the swinging young lover story. Otis and Angel Baby were on a Texas interstate when they noticed a young guy and girl walking down the road. Otis simply pulled over, stepped out of the car, and shot the boy 9 times, disposing of him at a culvert. Angel Baby was busy fighting the girl to get her in the car. Otis jumped into the driver's seat and took off. Later, Otis steadily and repeatedly assaulted the girl and shot her 6 times, leaving her dead body on the interstate. The two murdered constantly, killing for a car, killing for sex, killing for fun. Anyone who drifted in his or her path was in danger. Another girl was found completely nude in a field, the victim of over 100 stab wounds. Crazy as this may seem, it gets stranger. Otis and Angel Baby, now known as simply Baby, are approached by a man who calls himself the Professor and offers them a job: contract killing. As if this doesn't delight the two enough, he declares they must join a satanic cult in order to be eligible for the job. They met with the cult in Alabama soon after. At this meeting, a bizarre stranger introduces himself, calling himself Dr. Satan. Otis and Baby were supposedly required to murder a man to be accepted into the cult. As the story goes, Baby lured a man into the cult's lair, where Otis lay in waiting with a blade. Otis ripped out the man's throat. Otis, Baby, and the cult later cooked and ate the man in a black mass ritual. After their introduction, they began kidnapping babies for sale as slaves. Also mentioned is the fact that Baby starred in illegal pornographic movies with other girls from the cult, which the cult distributed. Of course, as with a lot of Otis's writings, not a trace of this satanic cult was ever uncovered, leading one to believe it a perverse work of fiction. More continuity errors here with Earl. And while this story about him being the one who approached them and asked them to join Dr. Satan's cult might be true, I'm more inclined to believe that Earl is Eve's ex-husband, and Otis was simply exaggerating here. But who knows what the truth is. Otis and Baby were supposedly told by the head of this cult to depart after murdering one of the cult's top leaders with an axe after a dispute over a bottle of whiskey. At this point, Otis claims he and Baby were contacted and offered another killing job. The mark this time was a trucker in Austin, Texas named Max Gilmore. Baby seduced the man in a local strip club called the Pleasure Hut and asked if he'd like to go out to her car for sexual favors. While engaged in receiving oral sex, the man tilted his head back to take a swig of beer. Otis, hiding in the back seat, stated he slit the man's throat so deep that the liquor just spilled out the bottom of his head. They buried the body, only to dig it back up later and decapitate it. Otis later buried the body with the limbs out of the ground so it would be discovered. The deathly duo then drifted northwest, as far as Oregon and Washington. Otis continued assaulting and killing, as had become his routine, while Baby returned home to her family, now known as the Fireflys by Otis, after another Marx Brothers film, Duck Soup. Otis would constantly battle with Cutter, now going by the name of Captain Spalding, for power over the family for years to come. Over the summer of 1975, Otis continued to roam the county alone and began his now famous summer of the Son of Satan murders. On July 4th, Otis was hitchhiking when Missy Albertson pulled over and picked him up. This was all he needed to inspire another murder. He forced Missy to pull off on an abandoned road, where he stabbed her, carved an inverted cross into her chest, and then dragged her out of the car. He then proceeded to defile her lifeless corpse. He disposed of the lifeless corpse in a ditch. Later, he returned to dice her up and pack her in garbage bags. By the end of the summer, 12 murders would be credited to the Son of Satan. Otis wandered a while, theft remaining his only source of sustenance. He was bouncing all over the country stealing and selling cars to survive. Time was getting short, and days were getting long for Otis. He returned to Rugsville with the hopes of attaining a job he once had, working for a man named Tommy Trucks. So all of this info provides us with quite the insight into how the Firefly family became the nefarious group of evildoers that they were. As I mentioned earlier, Cutter is essentially responsible for its creation with his actions and his warping of Eve, her sons, and later their daughter Baby, along the way likely collecting Eve's father Hugo and adding him to the mix as well. Then, as fate would have it, another individual who was just as depraved, or arguably even more depraved than Cutter, joined the family, the horribly abused and merciless Otis Driftwood. The character that we know the least about, Dr. Satan, was said to have once been a man by the name of S. Quentin Quayle, who delighted in experimenting on people with mental illnesses in an attempt to create superhumans. A man who Cutter says during his murder ride was hung by an angry mob from a tree near his museum. As we see at the end of the House of a Thousand Corpses though, Dr. Satan is very much still alive, and he has a whole host of his experiments guarding and adorning his subterranean lair. So that must mean that at some point, Cutter either met Dr. Satan and took him under his wing, or perhaps he rescued him from the tree that he was supposed to have been hung from, and brought him back to a location near his home so he could continue conducting his very important work. Something that could be supported by the fact that Dr. Satan wears an oxygen mask, which he may have needed as a result of the injury he sustained from being hung. Now the thing about everything we discussed is that it's given us a great window into understanding further why the Firefly family are the way they are. And as great as that is, we still haven't really gotten a handle on why they do what they do. It makes sense that Cutter became the man he is after he murdered his parents. It makes sense that Eve and her children became the way they are because of Cutter's influence. It makes sense that Otis is the horror show that he is because he experienced a truckload of horror in his youth. But there's still no motive to be found for them, outside of what I said earlier in the video at least, that being doing what they do simply because it's pleasurable. So is there anything more to the Firefly family's motivations? There is, but it still isn't that deep, which could very well be a good thing. When watching these films, whenever we see a member of this family committing an act of evil, we find them thoroughly enjoying every second of it. And in fact, they go out of their way to make any crime they commit as pleasurable as possible for them, whether that be through playing with their victims physically, causing them mental anguish, or anything else in between. And with that in mind, sadism and hedonism are this family's primary motivators for what they do. They don't kill anyone for any particular reason. They do it because they can, and because they love it. And there are absolutely no limits when it comes to murder and mayhem for the Firefly family. Make a man into a macabre mermaid sculpture. You betcha. Murder a woman and cut her tongue out so you can use her decaying body as a glorified fleshlight for a month? Absolutely. As far as individuals go, this is evil at its worst. There is not even a shred of a good reason for the members of this family doing anything that they do. There isn't some form of twisted justice associated with their actions, nor is there some abstract plan to punish a world that has harmed them in so many ways. The thing is though, there is another concept that underpins these people's twisted hedonism, a desire to live in a state of absolute freedom. When we were discussing Cutter's backstory, we learned the following. Sometime around 1928, the young troublemaker Johnny Lee was taken in by an extreme fundamentalist and local pastor named Theodore Jensen Rhodes, his wife Alice, and Charlie, their son. Charlie was the same age as Johnny, and the two were soon as close as real brothers. Johnny lived a repressive and solitary life of God on his new family's homestead and was ostracized by the community because the Rhodes were black. Young Johnny and brother Charlie dreamed of a more exciting life while helping run the family's 160-acre farm on the segregated outskirts of Rugsville. Johnny and brother Charlie dreamed of a more exciting life. Cutter, after living a tumultuous and suffocating life in his youth, desired a more exciting life, and he found a path to having such a life in quite the simple way, by doing whatever he wanted to, whenever he wanted to. Absolute freedom from the laws of God and man that would allow him to operate in the world in any dark way that he wished. And so he did. Further proof for how important this is in understanding the Firefly family's actions can be found in the films, where we often see many characters expressing their supreme distaste for society, civilization, and most of all, the government. People who want to live how they want to live, without anyone telling them how to do so, and in any way they wish to, regardless of what effect it might have on other people. So supported by the merciless, brutal, and cruel nature of one man who cared not for anyone but himself and the ones closest to him, a family was formed that would wreak havoc on the world for the sake of it, and to live what they believed to be the purest existence of all, one free of limits and rules that could keep them laughing well into their graves, and then some. And as I mentioned earlier, this is perhaps the most abhorrent mindset an evildoer can have, one without reason that allows evil to flourish just because it can. But now that we've answered this question, we've come to the final one we need to ask ourselves before we end this discussion. Why do we love these people so much? Why are characters so horrendously disgusting and downright evil, some of the most well-liked characters in the entire horror genre? Because they have personality. So often when we're met with horror villains and monsters, we find them either lacking any semblance of humanity or expressing the deepest, darkest aspects of it through their words and actions. The Firefly family, though, they're a raucous, humorous, and down-to-earth seeming bunch of deplorables who one could easily imagine being friends with. Spalding is as funny as he is disgusting, a man whose facial expressions and constant quips make him almost impossible not to love. Otis, as crazy as he is that strange kind of crazy that could draw in a crowd with his colorful opinions and language. And Baby, well, she's hot, crazy, and full of cheery life that belies the constant stench of death that follows her. What this series emphasizes for us is something rather unfortunate about humans, that so long as a killer is charismatic and smiling as they're stabbing their knives into a person's gut, chances are our minds are automatically going to find them likable in some way. There have been countless fiends throughout our history who have been lauded with attention, praise, and forgiveness simply because they're attractive or personable. Men and women who have slain countless individuals, who countless others would sooner invite into their homes and even their beds, rather than revile for the villains that they are. All of which just goes to show that as much as we can decry evil on the outside and make ourselves into paragons of goodness and virtue, all of us hold within ourselves a strange fascination with evil, a curiousness for the macabre and the terrifying that leads us to identifying with these villains and evildoers more than we should, and to standing in line to purchase tickets to a show that's filled with walking monstrosities, tearing innocent people limb from limb. So does that make us all evil? Well, sure, to a certain extent, we all are. But so long as your waking life isn't dominated by the fringes of evil lurking in the corners of your mind, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if we weren't, then we wouldn't receive great pieces of work like these films, nor would we be able to appreciate them, and that would be a damn shame. So as disgusted as I was at times when watching this family in action, I for one am glad that they exist, and that I had the opportunity to speak about them with all of you. And I hope by watching this video, you've learned a bit more about one of horror's favorite families, and the evil that they embody. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on the Firefly family? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.